You ever notice that in some settings there's an area of it that's disproportionately full of things happening? Like how in the Percy Jackson books, 80% of the beings from Greek mythology apparently just live within 5 minutes of the Empire State Building? I assume for a lot of the time it's for story purposes. Constant globe-trotting adventures are a bit difficult to keep pulling off. Alternatively, sometimes I imagine it's for ease of use. Like how in actual Dungeons & Dragons lore for the 5 people who don't always homebrew their own setting, basically everything in the Forgotten Realms takes place on Faerun. It's usually better to make one part of the setting full of stuff rather than try to recreate an entire planet. 40k, at least I'd argue, has 2 of those spots. One is Armageddon. Does GW need a spot for every single army to be throwing hands? Go to Armageddon. It's the perfect spot for an apocalyptic war. How couldn't it be with a name like that? But for lower key things, which means as potentially apocalyptic as Armageddon, but the armies aren't quite as big, we have the region of space located off in the corner of the galaxy known as the Calixis Sector. It's right next door to the Coronis Expanse. There's a lovely place called the Spinward Front located there, and it's full of all sorts of cults, traitors, and other nasties that can kill your player characters of Dark Heresy stone cold dead. Let's take a look at this region of Imperial space, because sometimes even 40k likes to tone things down from a 10 to an 8. But before I begin, do you know where you can find yourself some tasty meals made healthy and quickly? Because you can find them in your kitchen with Factor, the sponsor of this video. Factor is the premier meal delivery service that sends chef-crafted and dietitian-approved meals straight to your front door. With a balance of healthy fats, carbs, proteins, and at least 2 vegetables per meal, rest assured you're getting good stuff, and with over 100 weekly rotating options, there's plenty of options to suit your literal taste. And I can't emphasize enough how convenient they are. 2 minutes in the microwave and bam, instant food. No cooking, no cleanup. Cooking's a good skill to have, to be sure, but sometimes time and energy just aren't on your side. They certainly aren't for me after coming home from conventions. A 3-hour drive from Milwaukee and little sleep, can't say that leaves me with much energy to do anything but want to flop into bed. But you gotta eat, and luckily Factor not only gives me the food I need, but in a nice easy package. You can get yourself your daily greens too, a once daily greens drink that not only is good for you, but also tastes quite nice. To get yourself some Factor, look no further. Go to Factor75.com right now or click on the link in the description and use code PancreasFDG to get 50% off your first Factor box, plus free daily greens. That's code PancreasFDG at Factor75.com to get 50% off plus free daily greens. When it's time for a quick bite to eat, you can do no better than Factor, so get some today so you can eat quickly and well. Now then, let's see what happens when your D&D group tries to comprehend the horror that is the Dark Heresy critical wound chart. Relatedly, yes, this will be a semi-Dark Heresy video, if only because I really want an excuse to talk about that wound chart. The Calixis Sector is a sector of Imperial space on the edge of Segmentum Obscurus, about as far to the galactic north as you can go before you hit total nothingness. The Halo stars are found beyond, but speaking in terms of galactic stuff, those are mostly just fragments of star clusters before you hit actual intergalactic space. As far as meaningful settlement and whatnot goes, the Calixis Sector is the end of the line. This in part explains why the area is the setting of Dark Heresy and not another endlessly expanding war zone. There's nothing out here with that level of power, be it the Imperium or any of its enemies. There is a region known as the Spinward Front that does have plenty of larger scale conflict, but that's a topic for another time and itself is just a subsector of the Calixis Sector, which is then itself just one sector in this region. And that being said, calling this area an actual settlement is in many ways giving it a lot more credit than it deserves. Its initial discovery was by a rogue trader during the time of Sebastian Thor, that pretty cool ecclesiarchy fella that turned the organization into what it is in modern 40k. The rogue trader found what he called the Calixis Expanse, and it sure was there. As with most of the galaxy, it had plenty of remnant human civilizations from the Age of Strife and the occasional Xenos Empire, but in spite of this, it wasn't expanded into for some time. Even the Imperium sometimes remembers that overextension is a bad thing, and so it was largely left alone. That is, until M39, when a Lord Militant named Angevin conquered the region. It was then split up into the various sectors, systems, and whatnot, including the Calixis Sector, which was governed by one of Angevin's generals named Drusus. That guy was later declared an Imperial Saint, so either he was a stellar man himself, or perhaps more likely, one of the Imperium's most standout xeno-murderers, and they thanked him for it with sainthood. While it is now a properly settled sector, it's by no means a heavily populated one, or one with much of an investment in, at least by the Imperium standards. A lot of the sectors on the frontiers of the Imperium have minimal support and are essentially self-sufficient, and the Calixis Sector is another example of this. This was before the Great Rift opened and the Imperium was already stretched to its limits. This is something that happens regularly out in the sticks. It isn't strictly speaking abandoned by the Imperium, and I'm sure reinforcements and whatnot would be sent if they could be spared, but that simply isn't possible. And now with the Great Rift being open, the Calixis Sector is going to have to wait even longer to get anything worthwhile in terms of outside help. On the plus side, for one reason or another, it does appear to have an abundance of brave and plucky underdogs to keep things as stable as possible. On the downside, these are player characters in the Dark Heresy game, so collateral damage is usually just the word yes, and the amount of psychers exploding in the sector has to be 3 times the Imperial average at minimum. Still, I shouldn't be too mean. There are some islands of civilization here. The capital planet of the sector, Scintilla, is a lightly populated hive world. Lightly populated meaning there's only 25 billion people on it, as opposed to the trillions. This population, combined with the fact a lot of the early Imperial settlers before Angevin conquered the region were treasure hunters and rogue trader groups, have somehow turned this planet into one of the nicer hive worlds. The nobles live in opulence, of course, with the planetary governor living in something called the Lucid Palace, but even the hives themselves are described as magnificent. Granted, this is a rather generous reading, and I'd be willing to bet that's more of a general description of the hives as a whole rather than their living conditions. That said, I have one good reason why the hivers here are probably better off than in other hive worlds, at least in moment-to-moment life. Because the nobles here hunt them for sport. Corruption and rather uncouth practices run rampant amongst the noble houses of Scintilla, which in itself isn't anything new for the Imperium, but they seem to take it a bit farther here. But as for how that somehow makes the common man better off, if you want to hunt people for sport, they need to be at least moderately well fed, since where's the fun in hunting the first dying homeless person you find on the street? It is by all accounts, in spite of the above, otherwise a fairly typical hive city, with 2 of the major hives consisting of most of the population, while some of the outlying settlements make up for a lot of the economic value of the planet. Most of the middle hivers are indentured to the noble houses and work in the manufactorums of the world, while the underhives are like all underhives and full of mutants, gangs, and various cults. These cults frequently are only not chaotic because they ritually sacrifice you in the name of the Emperor rather than Khorne. Standard underhive business. In a rare actual difference though, the law does seem to intervene and keep things safe in the middle hives, no doubt solely to keep the production quotas fulfilled, but still, it's something. Dueling and trial by combat is meanwhile also entirely legal, especially common amongst the nobility, but appears that anyone can do it. I would advise against a non-noble player character declaring a duel against a noble, however, because the noble can almost certainly afford far better equipment than you can. It's also stated that you can have a champion fight in your stead, and I'm really curious if that crosses over with the hunting common men for sport thing that goes on. 2 nobles declare a fake honor duel and then rope 2 schmucks into fighting on their behalf. The 2 major hives of Sibelius and Tarsus, respectively, make up most of the political and manufacturing power of both the planet and the Calixis Sector. Hive Tarsus to me is the more interesting of the 2, although also the more dangerous, because it's smack dab in the middle of the worst desert on the otherwise temperate planet. This has resulted in it actually being a reverse hive, with the nobles living in luxurious subterranean palaces, while the other hivers live closer to the top in the desert, and therefore a complete shithole. While this isn't too unusual for hives, this does also mean the average worker has to climb to work rather than walk, which does, on the bright side, probably mean the grip strength of these hivers is the stuff of legends. Hive Tarsus handjobs go brazy, no doubt. The most interesting location on Scintilla is another city named Ambulon, a not-quite hive made notable by the fact the entire thing is on the back of a giant machine that crawls across the ground like a centipede. The engineers, in spite of being inferior to the nobles, have significant political power in this city, because no one really knows what happens if Ambulon stops moving. Theories range from it just collapsing to the entire thing becoming sentient and eating everyone inside, and on Ambulon, buildings collapsing is more regular than even the most poorly constructed hives. When your city crawls across the planet like General Grievous, there's only so much even the best engineer can do. Scintilla is overall the most important planet in the Calixis sector, because even beyond being the local hub of imperial bureaucracy and nobility, it being a hive means that most of the stuff made in the sector comes from here. Be it starship parts, weapons, armor, or anything more complex than raw materials, it comes out of this place. Of course, a manufacturing hub is nothing without somewhere to get resources and manufacture things from. As I'm sure many a RimWorld player knows after spending an entire session desperately mining every rock looking for components, Scintilla 2 would be nothing without the mining world of Sepphoris Secundus. And this place really blows. One name for it is outright the Suffering Kingdom, and you know if there's a name like that in 40k, the place has earned it. The entire place is a massive mine. Ore and whatnot constantly flows out of it, and essentially everyone out of the 12 billion people on it is a miner. As the core rulebook notes, this population would normally make it a great source of guardsmen recruits, were almost everyone on it not a sickly Victorian coal miner, and sickly is the operative word because there's a variety of fun diseases that no one else wants going off-world. The Imperium as a whole is a feudal empire above all else in how it functions, but this world is especially feudal. 9 out of 10 of whatever a worker earns and produces goes straight to the authorities. Entire generations of families will work in the same mine, oftentimes in the exact same segment. The tithes are the highest in the entirety of the Calixis sector here, and without the massive output of the planet, the entire house of cards would no doubt come crumbling down. The entire thing is a pyramid scheme of the barons keeping the populace in line by way of keeping them at a primitive level of technology, and the queen of the world ensuring her personal guard get the best of the best beyond the lesser nobles. There's countless small cults and other uprisings that occur, but they never succeed, and the planet is kept in its miserable little state in perpetuity. Supposedly, you can't torture people from this world, according to one arbitraze, because this planet is so utterly depressing that at worst the other pain is just another thing putting them down. At best, torture's a new feeling that isn't an 18-hour shift in the coal mine, so it really breaks up the monotony when an Inquisitor's acolyte starts breaking fingers. This is one of those planets that there is more lore on. There's an underground lake where hundreds of thousands of serfs lives, and the entire thing is somehow beset by blizzards that ravage it regularly, but at the same time, it just sucks. If you can think of a reason for something to suck, this planet has it. Which might sound repetitive, but I think it's important to remember that the Calixis sector exists as the home of a role-playing game. If you're the GM and your players are being real shitters, you have an entire planet of endless garbage society and garbage people and garbage everything to send them to make them behave again. I can go on about the garbage, sure, but here's my advice for this planet, viewer. If you plan on being a DM, just start making shit up. It's probably valid, and if not, you still have paragraphs on why this place is awful. And if you're a player, be nice. You should be nice now, because if you act a fool, you too can experience the crushing depression of yearning for the mines. The last major planet of Imperial control is Iokanthos. At only 5 billion people, we've finally found a world with less people on it than modern-day Earth. It's also one of those planets under Imperial control that doesn't look like it at first glance. The entire world is controlled by countless different minor warlords in a constant state of conflict, and the Imperial presence on the world is basically non-existent. The planetary governor is just the greatest of these worlds leading the best army, and the Imperium not only doesn't care, they love this situation. There's a plant on this world called the Ghostfire plant, and the pollen of it can be turned into a wide variety of combat drugs used by penal legions. I think this super PCP is actually one of the Calixis sector's greatest exports. Every 5 years, the Administratum comes to collect the tithe of this pollen, and the warlords are all more than happy to supply it because in exchange they get weapons, armor, vehicles, and fuel. It's a symbiotic relationship in the worst way ever. There is a place called Port Suffering, which is the strongest and frankly only major place of Imperial control. It has massive walls, constantly manned, but the only thing keeping it safe is the fact that it's the only place considered neutral territory on this world. After all, if the barbarians burn this place down, the weapons might stop flowing so freely, and the Imperium might just burn the planet down in response. This is one of those planets that I'm not terribly inspired to write about, though I do want to reiterate, as I did with the Misery Mining World, that there are several paragraphs about it alone in the Dark Heresy Core rulebook. First edition rulebook, that is. But for a quick speed round, how about I describe some of the various other locations on this world without actually describing them? There's a place called the Abbey of the Dawn, where a Sistera battle temple is located, no doubt given a constant supply of drugged-up barbarians to turn into drugged-up emperor botherers. There's a location called the Badlands, which is a non-stop battle royale because it's where most of the ghost fire is found, and also might have zombies walking around it. And there's a fella called Seth the Voice, claiming to speak for the Emperor. That's hardly anything new in 40k, and whether or not he actually does is as suspect as that claim always is, but whatever the truth may be, he has amassed quite the following and seems to fully believe his own hype, if nothing else. All of these planets are connected by a fairly robust set of trading ships, especially for a sector as isolated as the Calixis sector is. There's even a whole page on how shipborne life goes and what they're like, and with the example of the Misery Cord showing that, yeah, living on these things is rough. The Misery Cord is also apparently cursed, and whenever it docks, everyone freaks out a bit because everything from plagues to children getting kidnapped happens in its wake. The Calixis sector, as is the case with many of the RPG settings in Warhammer, gives you the quintessential view of what Imperial rule and governance is like. Which means it's almost entirely disorganized, there's several different power blocks all vying for the top, and all sorts of internal and external politicking going on to make things all the more confusing for anyone outside looking in. It's the kind of place Caiaphas Cain would either be right at home in, as he wines and dines everyone in the sector, or wishes he could leave immediately so we could go fuck Amberley Vale. There's of course the Adeptus Terra and the official governance of the sector, ensuring everything runs as smoothly as possible, as well as a few other Adeptas or Adeptuses, or however the hell you say the plural of that word. The Adeptus Sororitas, as established, have at least some presence in this sector, which, while not really a governing thing, they do tend to make themselves known to all parties involved whenever they go somewhere. They aren't a subtle faction, no one has ever accused them of that, but I have to imagine that they have their fingers in a few pies if only to keep everyone mostly non-heretical. You're never gonna totally stamp heresy out, but I'm sure they keep things mostly manageable, in day-to-day times at least. The Adeptus Ministorum is also a powerful force here, both because the first governor was a saint and therefore of interest to the ecclesiarchy, and I have to imagine because this far out in Imperial space, prayers are about the most reliable way to get help. There are a large amount of officially trained and ordained priests in this region of space, establishing the Ministorum as important. However, there's also an abundance of, shall we say, less properly trained ministers. There are some places that no one likes to go to, even holy men, and in these instances it's policy in this sector for pious but not properly educated individuals to preach the good word as best they can. This is most prominent on Sephirus Secundus, the planet being so depressing that apparently the proper priests want nothing to do with it. These devout but untrained clergymen still preach the Emperor's word, but dogma is not strictly followed by any means. Hell, on Iocanthos, the Emperor is worshipped as the ultimate paymaster, the divine force ensuring that mercenaries always get their proper payment after a job well done. It really drives home how divided even the uniting religion of the Imperium is, and all the while affirming that the Imperial cult and its church are powerful forces within the region. The Arbites are also here, although I find that less noteworthy, at least in terms of talking about lore. They're active and always upholding the Lex, they're judge dreading all over the place and doing all sorts of wacky legal shenanigans. For the purposes of a GM running Dark Heresy, this is good stuff, but for the purpose of talking about this place, all you really need to know is that yes, they do exist here. Aside from the standard Imperial affair, there are also the typical noble houses and religious cults. The most standout is the Redemptionists. As you may or may not be aware, that's a sect of the Imperial cult that was formed on Necromunda and managed to spread across the galaxy. It is considered by 40k standards an extremist branch of the Imperial cult, which is how you know you found yourself some real interesting characters. They go in on all sorts of people for being heretical, including ecclesiarchal priests, that they are more often than not officially declared heretics themselves. Go in on means murder, by the way, I'm sure you could figure that one out. Their serial killing sprees they call a crusade is in part because what the Cult of Redemption defines as heresy is anyone not in the Cult of Redemption. They're supposedly a bit more organized and a bit less murdery in the Calixis Sector, but, well, you know, 40k. Less murdery tends to mean that they'll save the murder of fellow Imperials for after the Xenos have been mostly taken care of. And then there's the 5 great houses of the Calixis Sector, 4 of which I'm only mostly sure are great houses because they're quite rude and only one of them actually has House X in the name. Thus, we will start with my favorite one, House Kryn. Not for actual reasons of lore, but because they were polite and proper and just call themselves House Kryn. These are the bankers of the Calixis Sector, because even in the 41st millennium, you can't escape the goddamn banks hounding you for any loans you might have. It is as simple as that, and from their description they don't seem to actually have much else going on, but by virtue of being the people in charge of the money, they don't need much else. They have the armies and whatnot this wealth can give them to secure their position, and they seem fairly content to continue being bankers and whatnot, which is actually kinda nice to see. I've no doubt they still do some imperial politicking, but the book doesn't mention anything along the lines of them trying to overthrow other houses or claim some ultimate victory. They just make money. If I had to guess, I'd say that at most their power plays are making someone indebted to them to use as a puppet. They even have a sort of act broke to stay rich thing going on, with most of their own villas and holdings actually not being as lavish as the other houses in the sector. They have all the money and everyone knows it. There's no need to flaunt their wealth because it's an unquestionable fact that they're richer than you. And then we come to the next house of the Castell Alliance. You see what I mean about the rest of these houses not playing nice with the names? This house's existence was a bit of a surprise to everyone else because its origins is essentially the most economically profitable game of Settlers of Catan ever played. One day, a meteor hit a world and killed most of the people on it. The Imperium responded as it always does. Demand that the tithes must still be met and to not give a shit about anyone on the world. So everyone banded together with what few resources they had, and in addition to the tithes, started quietly colonizing barren worlds, terraforming them into agri-worlds over the course of years. Culture-wise, they have some strange rituals involving tattooing their faces in artistic and weird ways, and every other house views them as a bunch of jumped-up gangers and primitives pretending to be nobles. But for the same reason House Kryn can exist, so too can the Castell Alliance. They own all the food. If you push them too far or bother them a bit too much, you no longer get to eat. That's a pretty good motivator to let them hang around the noble parties and whatnot, because if nothing else, no one actually needs money to live, at least in terms of biological requirements, but if the food stops shipping, things are going to get bad quickly. Next is the Devane Incorporation, a house that exists because it didn't choose the standard 40k path of religious warfare. It used to be a movement known as the Sepulchral Brotherhood, a massive collection of those lay preachers I was mentioning earlier that aren't educated but sure have the Holy Spirit to make up for that fact. As established, these preachers tend to not follow dogma very well, and the ecclesiarchy eventually told the Brotherhood to cease all their activities as they'd grown too distant from established dogma. And they did. Full stop, they just did. But they had all these people listening to them still and under their control, so they decided that their business would be dealing in serfs, or if we're being honest here, slaves. Indeed, the manpower of the various factories and businesses and what have you often comes as a result of Devane Incorporation serfs. They have something near unheard of in the Imperium, relatively intact and accessible records of all their serfs, because profit margins falling is the kind of thing that makes people keep track of that kind of thing. Nice to see that the scariest thing for a clerk in 40k isn't a Tyranid or Chaos Invasion, but the idea that if they lose track of someone, their quarterly reports will look slightly worse. In spite of no longer being officially a religious organization, there's still a bunch of Emperor botherers, and they actually recruit many of their nobles rather than just bloodline stretching to make more. Weird as that whole circumstance is, however, the nobles of the Incorporation also view their own thralls as nothing but a source of wealth, which is funny because there's significant odds the person saying this was a thrall a few weeks ago in themselves. Talk about pulling the ladder up behind you, though as a positive of all this, they're probably the only group of imperial nobility to not have an inbreeding problem. The religious aspects still around likely keep their thralls in check, because if you can convince enough people that toiling in that crapsack mineshaft is a religious obligation, you can make a lot of money off of them and keep them from rebelling more often than not. I think they're pretty neat, if only because 40k not taking the path of religious warfare is something you don't see very often, though depending on what your Dark Heresy group does, I'm sure you can get some religious warfare going if you try hard enough. Our second to last house is the Machenko dynasty, which does get some points for at least calling itself a dynasty as opposed to an incorporation or an alliance. This is, however, the obligatory, probably heretical house. Less than a century prior to when all this is taking place and being written about, the Machenko dynasty's patriarch was accused of all sorts of heresy and burned alive for it. The house had its assets all taken and was about as thoroughly destroyed as any line of nobility can be without everyone in it being outright murdered. But it didn't go away. In fact, it rebuilt itself in spectacular fashion, becoming one of the major houses again within those 75 years. That's a pretty damn quick turnaround from irrelevance for real life, I'd say, much less 40k where something happening within a single human lifespan means it's a blip on the radar as far as everyone's concerned. How did they pull this off, you might wonder? Good question. No one knows. The Machenko dynasty are incredibly secretive about their affairs and always respond to questioning by simply saying their business is their business, not yours. This has led to every rumor you can think of running rampant about the house, and conspiracies rage about how they're no doubt back on their old bullshit once again. Not helping this is that they seemingly have no holdings or anything like that. No agri-worlds to their name, no great factories. If you try to find something to point at as a clear source of where they get all their wealth, you won't be able to. They own plenty of hives and tracts of land, but nothing that would seemingly generate income to the extent that they have it. In spite of this, they're unfalteringly polite, throw great parties without going overboard into heresy, and are seemingly squeaky clean. There has, of course, been more investigations into them, but everything turns up just fine. No great sacrifices to Tzeentch for their wealth to return, no secret dealings with the Black Legion or anything, no foul Xeno supplying them with heretical tech to sell on the black market. Either they are back on their BS and they're really good at hiding it, or they just don't want the people who took all their stuff to know where the stuff is so they can take it again. And the last one is the Scalenhar hegemony, which is not even trying to sound like a noble house. They're weird. They're very weird. You ever meet someone that unironically idolizes Patrick Bateman? Is like that, but somehow less psychotic. They're a corporation, and their wealth largely comes from owning a lot of factories and whatnot. Very materialistic in both the literal and metaphorical sense of the word, this house. But they have this thing where their founder decided that the person most likely to succeed in the 41st millennium is obedient but still ambitious, completely immoral, unmoved by arguments based in emotion, and the ability to be both decisive and unforgiving. Aside from this meaning they're the most likely people to show you this image, they also have members of their house mold themselves into this personality. Members of it are only allowed to be themselves in select moments, such as at Scalenhar gatherings, and the higher-ups of the house have supposedly all become this personality completely and are no longer their original selves. And at least in the blurb, there's nothing about this being a result of strange science or sorcery. They're just so committed to the bit that they lose themselves in it. There is admittedly also a caveat where they have to give a physical part of themselves up, but this is oftentimes something like a hand. I'm not going to say in the science fantasy setting with demons that replacing someone's mind after you give them a prosthetic limb is impossible, and as a GM you could absolutely make it so, but for a random noble house in the backwaters of space, that doesn't seem the most likely option. And either way, this has allowed them to become vitally important to the sector, because morality and profit are seldom best friends. Scale and Har's industries make things like spaceship parts, and unless the Imperium suddenly has no need for the battle fleet in this sector, they're going to stick around being Patrick Bateman fans for quite some time. Now, in spite of the last few minutes being talking about all these houses and planets, you might think there's not a lot to go on, or indeed that 3 planets isn't all that much by 40k standards. There are numerous other planets mentioned, but those are in many ways footnotes. Like, one of them is a place called 88 Tanstar, and its lore is a single sentence mentioning how it's a colony planet with a navy depot on it. A lot of mysteries are left completely unsolved with barely a hint as to what they are, such as whatever the hell is happening with the Machenko. But allow me to offer you an explanation, as this is indeed something to keep in mind for all of you if you ever decide to go read through the Dark Heresy PDF. This book, and the Calixis Sector, exist to tell stories in. It's giving you the baseline, as a GM, to craft some kick-ass narratives with your friends. What is the secret behind the Machenko's re-rise to power? Maybe it is a chaos cult and your party can spend their game dealing with that before it brings down the sector. Alternatively, maybe they're being backed by rogue traders or the Inquisition for power in the area, and if your party plays things right, they can gain powerful allies. It's not like those two kinds of people lack for either wealth or reasons to want underlings across the Imperium. Hell, Dark Heresy has you running as inquisitorial acolytes. That could in itself be how the game starts. You reveal early on that your party's contact when the Inquisitor isn't around are members of the Dynasty, granting your party access to equipment they otherwise wouldn't have earlier into the game than normal. That, to me, would be a good way to ease people into Dark Heresy, and it's entirely possible for you to do it. All those one-off worlds are a blank check for the person running the game to create a narrative in, or for player characters to come up with something interesting for a backstory. It's the best kind of mystery, one with the intention of being solved by you for the sake of a good game, rather than for the sake of lazy writing, wanting to generate more income, or to give birth to 5 million theory videos on YouTube. Back on track, however, our final major power in the sector is of course the Inquisition. Dark Heresy is about running a game as acolytes, of course the Big Eye is making an appearance. The inquisitorial forces in the area are known as the Calixian Conclave, and there's a high council of Inquisitors in place to keep things running. There's dozens of Inquisitors in the Calixis Sector, far more than standard for such a relatively isolated backwater. As you can expect if you know anything about the Inquisition, they're all trying their best to make things right, and the moment you get past that goal, things start differing dramatically from Inquisitor to Inquisitor. The council in charge does a mostly alright job of making things run smoothly, but with so many Inquisitors of different philosophies in such a small place, it tends to be a messy affair at the best of times. Which incidentally, this does mean you can make your player characters face accusation of heresy while working under an Inquisitor's orders, just to screw with them a bit. It does tend to keep things interesting, however, and I'm sure every noble house in the sector wishes the Inquisition could go a year without giving them conflicting orders. That's the kind of thing that does not make for a stress-free life. Now, you might be wondering, why the hell there's so many Inquisitors in this region of nowhere space? Well, you see, the Calixis Sector is full of all sorts of nasty things that would love nothing more than to bring it crashing down, and probably a good chunk of the rest of the Imperium while they're at it. At the top of that list is Comus, the Tyrant Star, or the Hereticus Tenebrae if you're feeling formal. As with many things in Dark Heresy, it is left with a lot of blank spots to fill in by the GM, but what we know about this thing is the stuff of nightmares. It's essentially a black dwarf star that wanders the Calixis Sector, bringing forth all sorts of mayhem. Everything from volcanoes erupting to mass mutation and the appearance of psychers follows in its wake, causing untold mayhem for the planets unlucky enough to be graced by its presence. It never stays around long enough to properly study, and thankfully has the decency to not cause the planet it appears over to disintegrate or be flung out of their orbit into deep space, but the above problems are plenty on their own. I mean, ignore all the magical stuff that comes with it for a moment. Half your planet suddenly erupting like a supervolcano is going to seriously affect the trout population. The leading theory on it is that it's related to the warp and therefore chaos, but that's not at all a universally accepted fact among the Inquisitors present. There's a prophecy surrounding the Calixis Sector that makes frequent references to Comus, and with the mutations and psyker stuff, it's clearly at least related to the warp, but it being chaotic is where the sticking point comes in. On the one hand, the Great Rift can actually retroactively be explained in part by this prophecy, as it foretells doom, and a galaxy-wide chaos rift is certainly bringing doom to a couple people at minimum. On the other hand, the prophecy also frequently has the word devour appear in it, and with the 41st millennium heralding the en masse arrival of the Tyranids, that could easily apply to them as well. Hell, the book even says it might be connected to the Eldar in some way, since they're the psychic race of the galaxy, and this thing is some whack psychic nonsense. Could be a ghost of the Eldar pantheon, or maybe one of their old superweapons gone rogue without its masters controlling it any longer. Not helping all this confusion is the fact that no one is quite sure if Comus actually is the Tyrant Star. Plenty of people believe it is, understandably so, but some say it might actually be a Xenos engine of some kind. Others state that it could be a simple mirror of the true Tyrant Star, attempting to break through the barrier between reality and the warp. It's completely unpredictable and causes all sorts of nasty problems wherever it ends up, further hampering investigation. It might be gone for years at a time, or it might show up a few days after its last sighting, but near a completely uninhabited world. There might also be a mad rogue trader controlling it somehow, since the fella's name keeps popping up in relation to it. I'm curious to see what the new Dark Heresy Owlcat game will reveal about it, though at the same time I am a bit worried because, as with any mystery, explaining it runs the risk of ruining it. Doubly so for this one, since at least originally it exists as plot hook fuel. But fear not, we have far more than just that thing to worry about here, because there's plenty of nasty Xenos of the more standard variety as well. In spite of any expectations you might have, however, most of them are not the standard 40k affair. I'm sure, for instance, if you wanted to include the Eldar in a campaign you could, there's rules for them in Dark Heresy, and after all, they in addition to the Tyranids are directly mentioned in regards to the Tyrant Star. But the book itself has plenty of other horrifying options to choose from, and that's not even counting supplemental material. Even before I go through any of the ones listed, there's an entire segment in the book dedicated to creating your own aliens, so really any kind of alien you can think of here, most of which will be awful, can be found in the Calixis Sector. There's plenty of dead Xenos empires to be found, who's to say some of them aren't still kicking in some way or other. Although before I move on, shout out to the Eldar named Ulthair Elarian. He's a Corsair that's either constantly raiding Imperial fleets and facilities in order to recover something or someone precious, likely a soulstone, or because he just likes doing it. What a guy. His name also sounds like Eltharion. This is relevant to nothing, but I like Eltharion, so I'm wasting a few seconds of your life to bring him up. Something that the Imperium seems to have ported into the sector is the Brain Leaf, a plant from Catacan that attaches itself to living creatures, often humans, and overrides their consciousness as a way to both thread itself and keep itself safe. It's also a self-contained hive mind, with all the cells in it making up the greater consciousness. This is because Catacan is awful, as is anything that comes from it. There's demons as well, including a seemingly unaligned one of general chaos called an Astral Spectre, a being made of pure shadow that causes animals and people to become intensely frightened, shadows to become deeper and potentially gateways into the warp, and voices of the long dead to echo and machines to randomly glitch out. One of the more mundane threats is known as the Enolians. In one of the sector's many differences from 40k at large, this species has somehow managed to understand the difference between the Imperium and humanity. Plenty of actual 40k fans don't seem to understand that difference, let alone people in the setting, but these fellas have managed it. In terms of appearance, they sort of look like the Tau, but with more slits in place of their ears and noses. That, and they're yellowish green. The Imperium, as it does, stomped out much of their civilization, but seems to have been unable to totally kill them. This has caused them to, as a species, become absolutely maddened by even things like the Aquila, flying into a rage if there's some adept or other thing around like that. But like I said, they know not all humans are Imperials, and indeed not all Imperials are happy being Imperials. They can frequently be found as mercenaries for chaos cults, but also underground crime rings and the like, continuing the fight in a low-key way. They have technology similar to the Eldar in some ways, albeit not psychic. Monomolecular wires and shard weaponry await anyone fighting one of these creatures, although thankfully for their foes they don't appear to have the same speed and agility as the Eldar do. A neat little race of beings, wish we got a model of them. There also exist beings called simulacra. They're far more malicious in general to humans, because why wouldn't they be? Simulacra eat brains, and when they do so they can take on the appearance of the host flawlessly. They get their memories, voice, everything about them is copied without issue. As the brain digests over the course of roughly 4 weeks, they slowly degrade, however, forcing them to find new hosts to copy and repeat the cycle with. The Inquisition fears that this is for some insidious plot and is looking for their potential homeworld before they either infiltrate a hive's lower regions and exponentially spread, or infiltrate the nobility and tear things down from within that way. Honestly though, I think they're just kinda like that. If the only way to live is to eat brains and that happens to give you the person's personality, that's how it is. Not that that's a good thing, and this is one of those aliens in 40k that, quite frankly, yeah, I'm fine killing, but I don't think a grand scheme is really in the cards. The scheme seems to be trying to live. We've also got the Slough here, those unpleasant nightmares from someone's dreams who I really hope gets therapy. These creatures are walking swarms of maggots in the shape of a person that are almost all psychic blanks and therefore immune to psychic powers, including divination to see if anyone can figure out what the hell they're up to. They also eat brains, although they do this on dead bodies. That might sound nicer, but they tend to make the dead bodies themselves, so any credit you can give them has to go by the wayside. One of their favorite ways of killing people is to grab them by the face and subsume them into the maggot swarm, because who doesn't love a little bit of horrific imagery? They might also get high off the brain-eating thing, and might also be in some way related to the Ranged and Xenocides from the Great Crusade. In modern 40k, at least in the Calixis Sector, they do tend to operate more on the down low. Their chief operation there is the Amaranthine Syndicate, an organization of traders, ship captains, and the like that officially is just a trade federation, with the typical suspicions of them dealing in xenotech. In reality, they are the tip of the spear for the Slough to once again go loud and try and bring down the Calixis Sector as they use it to gather wealth, resources, and of course slaves for their eventual takeover. One of their favorite pastimes is making offers that poor Imperials can't refuse, all behind thick clothing and masks of course, so no one immediately points them out to the local arbites for the abominations they are. It starts off generous. They find someone in crippling debt or being pursued by enemies and offer to essentially take care of the issue nearly free of cost. All they need to do is a small favor, and at first it's the kind of thing that goes along with the Syndicate's front. Lower or raise the cost of some goods a bit, help out with a genuinely innocuous shipment of food, something like that. But they'll make sure their new target stays in their debt. Any enemies they have will suddenly have their own resources increased as the Slough helpfully point them the original target's direction. Accidents will befall the target, non-lethal of course, but financially devastating. And the Slough will just so happen to come around with a deal again, but now the task to pay them off is higher. Sabotage a piece of machinery that turns out to be critical in stopping a Slough raid, assassinate a member of the nobility to cause disarray amongst the upper echelons of the Imperium. This goes on until basically one of two things happens. The target gets killed doing what the Slough wants, or the target finally refuses an order and is eaten and replaced with another poor bastard. In either case, the Slough are winning because objectives were achieved or they got a tasty snack. And on the matter of them winning, I'd wager these disgusting creatures might be the doom the prophecy of the Tyrant Star is referring to. There's small but legitimate hints that are related to the Ranged and Xenocides like I said, which would mean the Slough are the continuation of the Xeno civilization that nearly brought the Imperium down when the Emperor was still walking about. Even if that isn't true, they fit the Devour thing just as well as the Tyranids do in some ways, given their proclivity towards eating people. The best case scenario is that the Slough are destabilizing the Calixis Sector to profit off of it, which weakens it for the Imperium's many enemies. Worst case scenario, they're destabilizing it because they plan on being the ones to take it down. To end off on a slightly lighter in tone Xenos race, we have the Cryptos. They're like the Simulacra, but funnier. They still do that funny little prank where they take over people, but without the degradation and with more gas. Literally, they usually take the form of a gaseous cloud, faintly emitting green light. According to the Inquisition, they consider themselves to be gods, but they're also fleeing from some unknown threat that utterly terrifies them. Much like the Simulacra, they almost perfectly take on the memories and personality of whoever they take over, preferring to take over those in isolated locations. They seem to dislike societies with primitive technology and avoid space travel as much as possible, but otherwise it's anyone's game. As they inhabit an area, they can slowly exert more influence over it, both through taking over someone sufficiently important and through a psychic influence that brings people under the Cryptos' thrall. Sometimes they're only in a location for a few weeks, other times they spend generations making the perfect little hidey hole to exist in. They're hard to predict because whatever timetable they're on, or whether or not whatever they're running from is nearby, is completely unknown, or if either things truly exist to begin with. They aren't warp entities, but they still possess people in a similar manner, and when they leave a host, it either kills them or heavily wounds them. Seemingly, it doesn't spiritually wound them, interestingly enough, which makes me picture their host exploding into blood like a JoJo character. They aren't hostile to humanity itself, but they are hostile to humans, and they view them as cattle to be used to maintain their secrecy. If you're wondering how the hell I call this funny at the start, it's because of how they remain hidden. They know the Inquisition will bring the hammer down if they're caught, and there is the matter of whatever they're running away from, so they do everything in their power to remain hidden and secret. The reason it's funny is because once they take someone over, they fulfill their job perfectly. Too perfectly. If they take over a garbage man, they will never miss a single bin and the streets will be immaculate. If they take over a priest, they will give the most impassioned sermons in the Emperor's name you've ever heard. An administratum clerk taken over by one of these beings will file the most accurate paperwork that would make even Gilman impressed with its efficiency, which means the the best way to detect a Cryptos infiltration is to look for places where things are less shit. The Imperium is so awful, and this is accepted as the norm so completely that Inquisitor will not only potentially investigate a place where things are going well, but there's non-zero odds they will be right to do so. Amazing, 40k. You are truly a wonderful setting. Now, I've reached the end of the lore I'll talk about, but I would very much like to share with you the greatest thing ever conceived in 40k, the Dark Heresy Critical Wound tables. The game itself is fairly known for being a lethal RPG, and reading these, yeah, that's a good way to put it. For example, if someone is hit by a grenade, it is completely possible for their leg bone to be turned into its own mini frag grenade, which then damages anyone nearby the guy whose leg turned into an IED. Alternatively, their head can explode, which has the potential for everyone nearby to be so shocked by what they saw, they just run for the hills immediately. Maybe you only critically shot a guy's leg off? In that case, there's so much blood pouring out of the stump attached to his hip where the thigh used to be that the area around him now requires an agility test to not eat shit and fall over when you're walking through it. Get a graphic description on how blowing someone's leg off with a lasgun causes him to desperately claw at his leg to stop the bleeding, only for it to mean nothing and he falls over in a pool of his own blood. Roll one higher on the leg laser chart and it's the same thing, but his dying screams drown out everyone else's voice within up to 20 meters. I don't know if Dark Heresy has verbal components for psyker powers, but if it does, you can shut down a wizard for a round by killing their friend hard enough. Hit someone hard enough in the head with a club and cause them to bleed out from the entirety of their face, or hit them so hard that their brains explode and anyone nearby now has a penalty to shooting because there's so much gore caking their eyes. That's not even the worst one. You can do that exact same thing, but this time hit someone with such force that the blow keeps traveling through and can hit someone else. Shoot someone in the chest so hard their head explodes and they fly into someone else and knock them over. Shoot someone's foot so hard their ammo somehow erupts into flames and kills anyone nearby. And this isn't even including the fact that if you're playing a psyker, your character's fate is almost certainly to become an unwilling demon host, and your powers are going to negatively affect everyone around you, allies included, because you took I cast Fireball D&D memes into a setting where casting Fireball summons ethereal monsters, and now you have to pay the price. Dark Heresy isn't an RPG, it's a Tom and Jerry skit written by Jigsaw, and that has been a brief look into the Calixis Sector, with a stopping point into the hilarious insanity that is the Dark Heresy Critical Wounds table. May you one day get to experience it in its full glory. I doubt I ever will, because I suffer from the curse of my friends only ever play 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, but reading through the books, I like to imagine the fun I could be having. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Dark Heresy Wound chart to my Calixis Sector, really spicing things up as I tread through the Emperor-forsaken hellhole that is YouTube. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. Calixis Sector, I hardly know her. Endless brain rot is all I have left. My head is empty after several years of making dick jokes, talking about elves, and making dick jokes about elves. I am a hollow shell of who I once was, and this is simply how my life is now. Have a happy night, everyone, for all I know before rest is agony.